Section 4 of Through Fairy Halls of My Bookhouse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Candace Stellick, Dallas, Texas. Through Fairy Halls of My Bookhouse. Edited by Olive Papier Miller. The Sleeping Beauty. A long time ago there lived a king and queen who said every day, "Ah, if only we had a child." But for a long time they had none. So when a beautiful little daughter came to them, the king could scarcely contain himself for joy and ordered a great feast to celebrate the event. He invited not only his kindred, friends, and acquaintances, but also the fairies who give gifts to children. There were 13 of these in his kingdom, but as he had only 12 golden plates, one of them was not invited. The feast was held with all manner of splendor, and when it came to an end, the fairies bestowed their gifts on the baby. One gave her virtue, another good nature, a third wisdom, a fourth beauty, and so on with everything that is good. But when 11 had said their say, suddenly the 13th, who had not been invited, presented herself at the door. She was an ugly old woman whose gifts to children were always evil. So the father of little Briar Rose had done well to find no place for her at the feast. But now everyone fell back in a fright before her, so she forced her way into the hall in a fury to think she had not been invited, and went straight up to the baby's cradle. "This is my gift to the king's daughter," she cried. "In her 15th year she shall prick her finger with a spindle and die." With these spiteful words she tossed her head and stormed out of the hall. The king was left in a panic, the queen was left in a panic, and all the guests were struck dumb with terror. But just at that moment the 12th fairy stepped forth, for she had not yet made her promise for the child. "Nay," she said gently, "the princess shall not die, but fall into a deep sleep." Now the king was so anxious to guard his dear child from misfortune that he thought the best way would be to remove all spindles out of his kingdom, and then she would never be able to prick her finger. So he gave orders the very next day that every spindle should be burned to ashes, and never another one made or used throughout the length and breadth of the land. Meantime the gifts of the fairies were plenteously fulfilled in the young girl, for she was so beautiful, modest, and kind that all who saw her loved her. But it happened on the very day when she was 15 years old, that the king and queen, being now quite at rest about their daughter, since they thought they had put all danger out of her reach, went away from home, leaving Briar Rose all alone. No sooner were they gone than the princess began to feel a great desire to go poking about the palace, into all the strange places she had never visited before. So she went into all sorts of great echoing halls and queer little chambers, and at last she came to an old stone tower with a narrow stair that went winding upward. Up the rickety steps she started. She climbed and she climbed. At last she came to a little old door with a queer old rusty key in the lock. When she turned the key, the door sprang open. There, in a dusty little room, sat a little old woman in gray, and she was working busily. "Good day, good dame," said Briar Rose. "What are you doing?" "I am spinning," said the woman, nodding her head. And she drew out a thread of flax, twisting it deftly between her fingers. "And what is that little thing you send twirling around so merrily?" "A spindle, a spindle." "Ah!" cried little Briar Rose, "I have never seen anything merrier." And she crept up closer and closer. At last, as she watched the twisting and twirling, she grew so anxious to try it herself that she said, "Good dame, pray let me try to spin." The old woman smiled till the curves of her mouth went way up under her long hooked nose. Then she handed Briar Rose the distaff and the spindle. The princess tucked the distaff under her left arm as she had seen the old woman do, and started to pull out a thread. But alas! She knew nothing of spindles, nor had she ever been taught how to handle one properly, so at the very first turn she clumsily thrust the point into her hand and pricked her finger. In an instant spindle and distaff dropped to the floor. Little Briar Rose sank upon a bed and lay there in a deep sleep which spread over all the castle. Then the little old woman in gray disappeared, and the room in the tower was quiet and still. Down below, the king and queen, who had just returned to the great hall of the castle, went to sleep on their thrones, and all their courtiers with them. The horses went to sleep in their stables, the dogs went to sleep in the yard, the pigeons went to sleep on the roof, the flies went to sleep on the wall. Even the fire on the kitchen hearth stopped flaming and slept in its embers. The great iron kettle above left off boiling, and the cook, who was just going to pull the hair of a careless scullery boy, let him go and sank down fast asleep. The wind fell. The flowers and grasses sank down on the earth and on the trees. Before the castle not a single leaf stirred again. Round about all there began to grow a hedge of thorns. Snow fell with ice and sleet. So years passed by, and every year the hedge grew denser and higher, till at last it hid every tower from sight. Nothing at all could be seen of the castle, not even the flags on its roof. And over the spot, year in and year out, it was always frozen winter. But the story of the beautiful princess slept bound in her castle still went abroad through the land. From time to time kings' sons came and tried to force themselves in through the thorny hedge to awaken her. All these the hedge used sadly. The thorns held fast together as if they had hands, and tore their fine clothes, and scratched and pulled, and kept them tight caught as if in a net. And Briar Rose slept on. At last, after many, many years, there came to the land a certain king's son, to whom an old man told the tale of the princess, and how sadly the king's sons had fared who tried to do battle with the hedge. But this youth said, "I am not afraid of the hedge. The hedge is nothing to me. I shall go and awaken the beautiful princess." The good old man did all in his power to dissuade the prince, but the youth would not listen to his words. Off he set toward the frozen castle. As he drew near, he felt its icy breath. He saw the snow over all and the giant thorn hedge that rose threatening before him. But he strode confidently on, and when he came square upon those dark bushes, lo! they turned suddenly fresh and green, blossomed with large and splendid flowers, and parted of their own accord to let him safely through. Above, the snow stopped falling. Beneath his feet ice melted, flowers and grasses lifted up their heads. By the time he reached the castle yard, all signs of winter had fled. The earth was in bloom about him. He saw the horses and dogs asleep, the pigeons on the rooftops still with heads buried under their wings. When he entered the castle, the flies were still asleep on the wall, the fire still slept in its embers, and the cook was still holding out her hand as though to cuff the scullery boy. Within the great hall the king and queen lay asleep on their thrones, with their whole court sleeping about them. All was so quiet everywhere that a breath could have been heard. At last the king's son came to the stone tower with the narrow stair that went winding upward. Up the rickety steps he climbed and opened the door of the little chamber. There before him on the bed lay Briar Rose asleep. Her cheeks were faintly flushed, her hair was like gold, and her clothes were all quaint and old fashioned, like those his great great grandmother had worn. So beautiful was she that the King's son could not turn his eyes from her. As he looked, he stooped down and gently gave her a kiss. The moment she felt his kiss, Briar Rose opened her eyes and awoke. Then she looked at him sweetly and slowly rose from her couch. Hand in hand down the stairs together they went. When they entered the great hall of the castle, the King awoke, and the Queen, and the whole court, and all looked at each other astonished. The horses in the courtyard stood up and shook themselves. The dogs jumped up and wagged their tails. The pigeons on the roof awoke and flew away into the open country. The flies on the wall crept again. The fire on the kitchen hearth flickered and flamed up. The great iron kettle began to boil, and the cook soundly boxed the ears of the scullery boy. The very next day the marriage of the King's son with Briar Rose was celebrated with all manner of rejoicing, and inside the castle and out was the life and bloom of the spring. End of section 4. Recording by Candace Delic, Dallas, Texas.